Hello and welcome everybody from Joburg. It is season 6, episode 17 of Conservation Conversations. So tonight we are joined by Steve McKean, a colleague of mine here at BirdLife South Africa, and we've got Jess Wilmot helping out in the tech support role. I think you're all familiar with Jess. She's hosted a number of episodes by now. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining. Yet another lovely episode of Conservation Conversations. I'm sure it's going to be fascinating, and I'm very excited for one to learn about OECMs from Steve. But before we introduce him, we've just got our standard housekeeping to get through. So, of course, as I think a lot of you know, you've seen this all before, but perhaps you can share with a friend. Within a day or two of this seminar, you'll be able to find it on YouTube, as well as all past episodes of Conservation Conversations. So if there's someone you know that would be interested in what we end up discussing tonight and you want to share it with them, check in on our YouTube channel. Otherwise, you can email us at conversations@birdlife.org.za and we can also share the recording with you. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, and Twitter. Anyway, on to tonight's topic, where we're joined by Steve McKean. I often find myself calling him Steve McQueen, with the obvious difference that Steve is a lot younger and considerably more handsome than Steve McQueen. And let's hope he doesn't do a great escape and leave us high and dry after my mishap with PowerPoint earlier. Steve's going to be telling us about OECMs, which are a bit of a mouthful, but they stand for something that's even more of a mouthful: other effective area-based conservation measures. It's quite an esoteric subject, but luckily we have an expert to tell us all about that and what it means. A little bit more about Steve. He is a colleague at BirdLife South Africa. He's got over 33 years experience as an ecologist, specializing mainly in sustainable resource use and natural resource management. He's got a strong interest and expertise in vegetation ecology, resource economics, water resource and catchment management, and in developing and implementing market-based mechanisms and incentives to address conservation challenges. His passion is in developing and implementing incentive-based solutions to conservation challenges. He was one of the initiators of the KZN Biodiversity Stewardship Program in 2005-06 and currently manages the OECM project for BirdLife South Africa. So that's all. Sounds very high level and very technical. And yeah, my aim today is to try and help Steve break that down and make it something a bit more approachable. So speaking of vegetation ecology, resource economics, water resources, catchment management, these are all things that are very critical in KZN. So Steve, if you'd like to, oh, there you go, you got your camera off already. I'm going to stop sharing. So you're from KZN, Steve. You hail from the same hometown as me, which is Hilton in KZN. And those challenges that you deal with are very critical in that area with all the agriculture, forestry that goes on in that part of the world. So yeah, I'm excited to learn a lot more about that and get a bit more insight into KZN. So I'm going to hand over to you, Steve, and stop talking, stop babbling on. And yeah, we're very excited to have you. We've got lots of participants from all over the world, including a number from KZN as well. So yeah, we're very excited to hear what you have to say to us tonight. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I'm hoping that by the end of this webinar, you'll be all a little bit more familiar with an important aspect of conservation outside of formal protected areas and what we as BirdLife South Africa and partners are doing in this regard, and also how you can contribute in a small way. It's seemingly a small, but nonetheless important way. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about OECMs, and I'll talk again. It's an acronym that is a bit of a mouthful. It's other effective area-based conservation mechanisms, as Kurt already mentioned, and how they can recognize hidden conservation hotspots in our country. So, what actually brought me here? So, you've already had a bit of my background, but I was an ecologist with Ezembelo Cays and Wildlife and the early days Natal Parks Board since 1991 till about 2018. So that's good 26 years odd. And then I was part of, as already mentioned, I was part of a team that got biodiversity stewardship established as a program in the province in 2005, 2006. And this ultimately led to the founding of Conservation Outcomes, which is a small NGO which is dedicated to the establishment and support of protected areas outside of formal state-run areas. And That small NGO is now 10 years old, and two friends and colleagues of mine and I co-founded that, and we established a very, very good partnership with BirdLife South Africa in 2018, looking mainly at the conservation of misbelt grasslands and blue swallow in particular. And so I've been working very closely with BirdLife since 2018, and I like to consider myself as having been a staff member since then. And this led me on to where I am now, in full time with BirdLife, managing this OECM project, which I'll tell you a bit more about this evening now as well. So when you think of conservation, what actually comes to your mind? Although it's obviously critically important, conservation is not only about declared nature reserves and national parks. A large proportion, if not the majority, of our important biodiversity occurs outside of these areas, in communal, private, and other state-owned land and marine areas as well. We can't always, people often forget about marine areas, but marine areas are crucial to all of this. Although we've had approximately 2.5 million hectares of new protected areas in communal and privately owned land declared in South Africa over the last 20 years, and that is predominantly through biodiversity stewardship, by the way, many of South Africa's most important bird habitats aren't actually formally protected in any way. With only about 9% of South Africa's land area and 5% of our marine areas are formally protected. So not all the areas that have conservation value can be formally declared for various reasons, which are probably the subject of a webinar all on their own. But this is where these other effective area-based mechanisms come in, or OECMs. So what is an OECM? So I've tried to put this in a little bit more simple language than what the next slide will show. But it's essentially an area which has conservation or biodiversity value, but does not necessarily have conservation as its primary objective, as does a national park, a nature reserve, or even a protected environment, all of which are legislated areas in terms of our Protected Areas Act. So as we've said before, OECM is an acronym for Effective Area-Based Conservation Measure, and this simply means that there are areas outside of formally declared protected areas which may not be managed specifically for the purpose of conservation, that do contribute to conservation targets nonetheless, and which should be identified, assessed, recognized, and reported on. So an example of an OECM could be an area such as the natural habitat parts of a national botanical garden. It could be an estuary. We are looking at these, many of you would have heard about the penguin island closures in the news of late. It could be a piece of indigenous forest that is managed by a community that is a sacred site. It could be an area of grassland that is properly managed for livestock grazing by a farmer. And all of these could be recognized as an OECM, provided the criteria are met for that recognition. And I'll go into the criteria a little bit more in a few slides' time. So importantly, potential OECMs are also areas with biodiversity conservation, but don't necessarily, as I've said, have conservation as their primary objective or core function. And these areas can include government-owned land. And here we're thinking specifically, there are quite a few military areas in the country that have actually got sort of conservation management plans. They're not used for anything other than military training, but they have conservation value. They can be recognized as OECMs. Then there's community-owned land, it can be privately owned land, and as I mentioned, marine environments. But importantly, OECMs are designed to recognize good conservation work already being done and not to impose. As I mentioned earlier, they're meant to be less onerous than a formal declaration, and they are an invitation to look again at what is already working and who's making it work. They're not intended to replace formal conservation areas, but are meant to complement them, as I'll get into a little bit more later as well. So here is the formal Convention on Biological Diversity definition of an OECM. And so an OECM is a geographically defined area other than a protected area, and that's an important bit, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes For the in situ, that means in-place conservation of biodiversity. So that means it can't be somebody's back garden or something like that. It has to be a natural area that is not it's not disturbed, and of biodiversity and associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, the cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. So that's a bit of a mouthful. But people who make these OECMs possible include farmers, as I've mentioned, and it could be through rotational grazing and wetland protection. Importantly, communities through things like sustainable fishing, local stewardship, community areas, through sacred sites that communities have managed for traditional reasons for, in some cases, decades or centuries even. And then private landowners who care deeply about the land and would like to contribute and be recognized for their contribution to conservation. And then, as I mentioned, government as well. And then just on the slide, it'd be interesting who, I'm sure many of you can spot the Orobi in this photo. So have a careful look. All right, so what are some examples of potential OECMs? They can include community sacred sites, as I mentioned, marine areas such as Penguin Island closures, grasslands, estuaries. Grasslands used for cattle grazing often have biodiversity value, even though, as I mentioned, biodiversity conservation is not the primary objective. But any area which is in a natural state, perhaps as a consequence of good management, but is not necessarily managed to be a conservation area, could qualify to be recognized and reported on as an OECM. And again, as provided that the area meets the 8 CBD criteria, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So there is a process which needs to be followed for an OECM to be recognized and reported on. So the first step is the area needs to be scoped. And there are 2 steps, which, again, I'll describe in a little bit more detail to come. But the first thing we need to check is that the area is not an already declared area. So that if it's already declared, it cannot qualify to be reported on as another effective conservation measure. And then the second one is that it potentially has biodiversity value, and this is generally done as a desktop exercise, overlaying maps of critical biodiversity areas and so forth to see if they correspond. And then before an assessment can be done, that potential OECM, then before an assessment can be done, let me just run through all of this right. Then landowner permission and consent is critical. We cannot do any of this without the consent of whoever the landowner or the governing authority of that area is. Firstly, permission to actually assess it, and then secondly, permission to report on it. So the government must be obtained, and once this is done, the area then becomes what we call a candidate OECM, and the assessment can then be done to check if the area meets the 8 OECM criteria for recognition and reporting. If the criteria are met and the governance authority consents to the area being reported, then the reporting process can be entered into. Okay. So these are the 8 OECM site level criteria for recognition and reporting as an OECM. So of particular importance here are the criteria relating to governance and management. There must be a governance authority in place, that may be, it can be a local, provincial, or national government, it can be a private landowner, it can be a community, it can be a communal property association, a company or trust, it could be a small-scale fishing zone, although I believe that none of those exist in this country at the moment, they haven't been set up, although the law does allow for it, but there are many other possible examples. And then management also needs to be for the long term. And the question is then, what does that long term mean? And as the NGO sector in this country, we've looked at these criteria and tried to interpret them in a South African context. And while there's no firm answer to this at the moment, we have recommended that this be no less than 10 years with an option to renew, because there has to be some permanence for it to have conservation value. And then each area needs to be assessed on its own merits. We are waiting for a set of norms and standards from the government, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment to be developed. And these are in process and very close to being put out to public comment. And this will hopefully give us more guidance as to what constitutes long term. But as you can see, the first two are the screening criteria. As I mentioned, the first one says it cannot be a protected area already. And that means anything that in this country that is recognized in the Protected Areas Act. So it could be a provincial nature reserve, it could be a mountain catchment area, and there are many other examples of that. And anyway, I'm not going to run through each of these individually. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to answer afterwards. But yeah, there's I think the emphasis really, and then importantly, the site has to be a geographically defined area. We've got to be able to define where that area is and to be able to put it on a map. So although, for instance, a community area may not have a fence around it or something like that, it might be designated through word of mouth or something like that. We must be able to work with people to draw a boundary and at least be able to map that, and so that it can be reported on. Okay. Right, so let me give you a quick background on why we need to assess, recognize, and report on OECMs as a country in South Africa. As South Africa is a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that means the country has agreed to conserve a target of 30% of its land and seascapes by the year 2030, and that is a hugely ambitious target, and one that's we're going to have to work very hard to meet. The CBD, or as I'll just refer to it as the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is an international legal instrument for the conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of its component and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from its genetic resources. The importance of increasing our protected areas and OECMs and aiming for the 30 by target is critical, is really important for South Africa, because if we fail to meet our commitments, there are a number of negative consequences, including possible ecosystem degradation, the disruption of vital services like clean water, pollination, climate regulation, and as well as severe damage to our environment, our economy possibly as well, and our international standing. All of those sorts of consequences that are possible if we don't actually meet these goals, or we seem to be making a really good effort to doing that. As a country, we're in the process of finalizing our national targets. They haven't been finalized as yet, as part of what they call the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, or the NBSAP. It's another acronym. And then, the OECMs provide an internationally recognized framework for South Africa to officially recognize effective conservation work done for nature outside of our protected areas, and to report on those conservation models to the Convention on Biological Diversity to meet our targets. And importantly, it intends to be inclusive. It needs to recognize sectors of society who may previously have been excluded for the contribution they are making to conservation. Okay. Then continuing on from the Convention on Biological Diversity, South African National Parks has what they call the Vision 2040. And it's about what they call building mega living landscapes. And it's a vision. So it is something that is it's something that we hope we can achieve in years to come. But it imagines a future where our national parks are not isolated islands, but part of a vast connected mega living landscape that support both people and nature. And OECMs fit into this very importantly, because they help this ambitious vision to be made real by expanding our conservation beyond protected area fences, to recognizing and supporting conservation on private community areas, traditional land and seascapes. And then it also connects key areas, keeping natural corridors open so that wildlife and systems can thrive across entire regions. And then it looks at building resilience, helping landscapes and people adapt to challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss. And then, as I've mentioned as well, in trying to include everybody, empowering communities, landowners, and custodians to be part of the conservation story. So in short, OECMs will contribute to turning the Vision 2040 into reality by connecting protected areas, people, and productive lands into living and resilient landscapes that benefit both nature and society. So that it's all... OECMs are important for a whole bunch of reasons in this country. Right, so how do OECMs fit into our conservation estate? Well, we've got protected areas, consisting of our national parks, our nature reserves, and our protected environments. And these are all declared in terms of the Protected Areas Act, in terms of different sections of them. I won't go into that detail now. And then we have added to that our OECMs. That makes up our conservation estate, which we then can report as a country to the World Database on Protected Areas as our contribution to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that's then formal state-owned protected areas make up at the moment only about 9.2% of South Africa's conservation estates. And so a significant proportion of our biodiversity is found outside these areas, as I also mentioned earlier. So this makes it imperative that we work with landowners and communities and seascape management authorities to collaboratively conserve this biodiversity. On the marine side, we have 5.4% of our marine areas. We have about 3,000 kilometers of our coastline, and only just under 5.5% of that is actually in any way formally protected. And South Africa is committed to protecting 20% of our coastal marine areas. And they term it the mainland exclusive economic zone by 2030. So with 15% of that comprising of more formal marine protected areas, and then the other 5% of OECM. So there's a lot of work to do in the marine space as well. How does this all fit into biodiversity stewardship? Biodiversity stewardship is probably the subject of a webinar in this country all on its own, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail now. But I think it's appropriate to say that OECMs are likely to be assessed, recognized, and reported as part of this biodiversity stewardship model that we have in this country. So this slide is just to show a little bit of context in how OECMs fit in. So it shows the stewardship hierarchy and which categories could be recognized and reported on as OECMs. And as you can see at the top, the formal protected areas are not eligible, but there are categories of stewardship that could be eligible, and those are generally done in terms of contract law, a biodiversity management agreement, a biodiversity agreement, and then a conservation servitude, which is they're all done in terms of contract law. And then you get things like biodiversity partnership areas, which is a little bit of a vague term, but it refers to aspects like conservancies, where there's really nothing formal in place, but it does provide an area that we can target for particular areas within those conservancies to look at, to expand the OECMs. And then again, most countries are not in a position to be able to, and South Africa in particular, the government is very unlikely to, and unwilling probably, to buy up and manage land for conservation. So conservation is to a large degree in the hands of people on the land and managing marine areas, and who manage our seascapes. So it's critical that they contribute and we work with them. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. So why do OECMs actually matter? Well, OECMs highlight the many people, places, and practices that are contributing to conservation, even if they aren't inside formal nature reserves or appropriate for formal declaration. So even sections of commercial farms that are left natural have conservation value, and this is aimed to try and recognize those. So by working alongside national parks and reserves, and protected environments as well, and other forms of stewardship agreements, OECMs help create bigger, more connected spaces for biodiversity to thrive, and also strengthens our ability to tackle challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss. They recognize the efforts of local communities, private landowners, government departments, and conservation agencies, and they give credit and support to the wide range of people who are protecting nature. South Africa has set important targets, as I've been talking about, for the amount of land and seascape we intend to conserve over the next decade, and these will play a big part in helping us to achieve those targets. And by identifying what's working well and what could be improved, they also help to strengthen the overall network of protected and conserved areas in the country. And they make conservation, the intention is to make conservation more open and fair by recognizing different types of land and seascape use, and giving a voice to groups that may be left out of conservation approaches in the past. Okay. There are benefits of OECMs, and a lot of the benefits are to the country and being able to report on targets and things, but there are also benefits to landowners and communities. Although there are no sort of, at the moment, or I believe they're working on them, there are no things like tax benefits and stuff. There are other benefits apart from simply to conservation in South Africa and to the country. There's certainly a potential marketing benefit for an area that is recognized and reported on as an OECM. For instance, I can think of like timber the industry with the FSC. If the areas that are owned by timber estates that can be reported on as OECMs, I'm sure that there's a benefit in that way. Some ecotourism operations which may not lend themselves to formal declaration, I'm sure that there's a potential marketing benefit to them, and it'll depend on what the primary land use is as well. And there could also be wider opportunities for potential funding if an area is recognized. It certainly shows the commitment of a community or a landowner or a governance authority to a conservation ethic, and that certainly would then help to open doors to potential funding assistance should it be needed and if it's available. And then, yeah, it's an OECM that's recorded on the South African Protected Area Database, and hence it could be highlighted as being it would be highlighted as being of conservation significance, and so it could possibly discourage destructive land use change. For instance, mining, although an OECM is not protected from mining through legislation as would a nature reserve be. So yeah, they are potential benefits, and I think those will be developed over time as we enter into recognizing and assessing OECMs in this country. So what is BirdLife South Africa's role in all of this? I've spoken a lot of, hopefully I haven't bored you all to tears by now, but we'll get into hopefully a little bit more interesting stuff. So our role here is we have a 3-year project and supported by the WWF Nedbank Green Trust. And it has 6 main objectives, which I'm not going to go into now. But basically, the BirdLife South Africa and the management team's main function is to facilitate a process to roll out OECMs in the country, and to work with the provinces, with biosphere reserves, and with the marine sector as well, and with government, to build on the success and learnings of a lot of really good pioneering work done in the Western Cape, which ended in 2023, that is also supported by the WWF Nedbank Green Trust. There was a national OECM boot camp, which basically tried to just set a roadmap for OECMs in the country, and that was done in 2023. And then there are other South African case studies which are led by the IUCN and other entities as well. And then we have close collaboration with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, which is very important, and the South African National Biodiversity Institute. And as I think I mentioned, this is a 3-year project. It started on the 1st of July 2024, so we're just over a year into it. We have made some significant progress, but I'm not going to report on all of that now. Rather talk about how you as a birding fraternity can possibly contribute to all of this. So what can birders do to contribute to OECMs after all that technical stuff that I've been through? You can do lots of things, actually. You can share sightings via BirdLife or the South African Bird Atlas Project 2 or eBird. These are all apps that you can download onto your phone if you haven't already. And this contributes to citizen science, and that citizen science is critical for use. You heard Kurt talking about the Birds on the Brink book and the red listing that's recently been done. That could not have been done without the citizen science contributed by BirdLife and the South African Bird Atlas Project. So it really does help to look at conservation priorities and to focus conservation efforts. So, and it only happens when birders and people like you out there share your sightings via those apps. You can engage positively with landowners and communities when birding in their areas. And for those of you who are into social media, tell the stories. If you have blogs, post photos, social media postings, so on and so forth. And then something close to my heart, support biodiversity stewardship initiatives by supporting NGOs like BirdLife South Africa, Conservation Outcomes, and WWF South Africa, and all of these NGOs have a strong emphasis on working with communities and landowners and marine conservation authorities outside of formal protected areas to establish and support areas outside of state-run areas. You can learn and advocate through your local bird club, and then bird ethically and responsibly. And I'll get into a little bit more about what that means now. So what is ethical birding? When you go into an area, it's the right things to do are to stay on the paths that are there. Don't go wandering off into areas where you shouldn't. Where you can use a community bird guide, please use them. They are particularly the ones that have been trained and gone through BirdLife South Africa. They are highly competent, really good individuals, and they are very knowledgeable and always useful and worthwhile to engage with where possible and where they are around. Importantly, respect nesting sites. Don't disturb or get too close, particularly in a species breeding season. And here I can think of particularly of the bird that I've been working with in the last while, blue swallows. Part of the reason I think that we are seeing them in a decline is because there have been and are people that go to the nest holes in their breeding season and possibly disturb them, and which can lead to abandoning the nest and so on. So it's not good to go too close to any nest, particularly in the breeding season. Respect the local customs rules and private property. Don't abuse a landowner's or a community's good grace to let you onto their property. Leave no trace. Don't litter. Don't damage the environment. I think that goes without saying. And then don't use call playback when you are bird watching as well. That often has very negative impacts on species, and particularly at certain times of the year. So it is always better not to use playback if you want to minimize your impacts on bird species that you are looking at. So in closing, OECMs can be potentially the hidden heroes of conservation in our country, because most of our important areas, conservation area, occurs outside of formal protected areas, as I've said a good few times this evening. It is critical to collaborate with and support communities, landowners, and our seascape management authorities to conserve key areas, but also ensuring sustainable livelihoods. I think a key thing for the whole other effective area-based mechanism is not to destroy people's livelihoods in the process. There needs to be it needs to be sustainable. So it's about maintaining and even enhancing, in cases, people's livelihoods as well as conserving. And then, yeah, OECMs will contribute significantly to our country's conservation targets and our contribution to the Conventional Biological Diversity Target 3. And our BirdLife South Africa, together with our key partners and collaborators, we're supporting and facilitating the rollout of OECMs in South Africa. And I'm sure the question will come up, so I'll mention it now. At the moment, there are none in the country that have actually been properly assessed and meet all 8 criteria. So that is something that we are trying to address in the next couple of years and working with our partners to address. So again, we can all contribute, and to reiterate, you can share your birding observations with citizen science, applications like BirdLasser. And as I said, this assists scientists and conservationists in identifying and prioritizing areas for conservation actions, and it assists species assessments and a whole lot more than that. You can support biodiversity stewardship, as I said as well, and support landowners by visiting the areas where possible. Join BirdLife South Africa, contribute to conservation NGOs who work with landowners to secure and support areas, and then bird ethically. And who knows, next time you're out birding, you may well be standing in another effective area-based conservation mechanism. And lastly, I think to just thank our funder, the WWF Nedbank Green Trust, without which this work could never be done. Our partners and collaborators, Conservation Outcomes, SANBI, and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. And then, of course, to all of you for your time, commitment to and support of conservation initiatives like this. because without you out there, none of this would be happening. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and it's time for questions and discussion.
Steve,
Over
thank you
to
very, very
Kurt.
much for that. I think you did a great job, and it certainly wasn't esoteric or confusing at all. So I gave you a grilling beforehand, but I think you
Hope
did a
not.
fantastic job of translating it for a layman like me. So thank you very much. And I think if you are seeing all the rounds of applause and hearts and things that are being sent up, I think our attendees agreed as well. Before we get on to questions, I do just want to take a second to say thank you very much to our audience, and to BirdLife South Africa's supporters in general. Meeting a lot of you at the Bird Fair this past week was really incredible, and I think we're in a fantastic position. We're very, very fortunate to have the amount of supporters and sponsors and donors and just people interested, people showing up to conservation conversations every week. We're really in a fortunate position. So yeah, before anything else, I just wanted to say that. But Steve, thank you. Great job. Really, really fantastic. Um,
Thanks, Kurt.
we've got a lot of people with burning questions. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, but I think given the time frame that we have, let's jump straight into the questions. Except one thing, you did express a desire to run to get training and get ready for comrades next year. How's that going?
You had
Is
to
that
bring
still
that up.
on?
Okay.
Sorry?
Yeah, I hope so. I did tweak I think my hamstring this morning on a run, so I'll see how it feels in the morning. But yeah, I did make a kind of a commitment to one of our colleagues, Cassie, and so I intend to try and do my best to meet that commitment. We did talk about running it together on the hundreds running, but we did get some good advice from none other than Bruce Fordyce that if we want to do that, we need to run it next year as well. So I took a bit of a gulp, but yeah, we will do our best to try and do that. Yeah,
Good. And
I'll
Steve,
write the old.
on that run from Durban to Maritzburg or vice versa, are we running past, or on the drive down the N3, are we running past any OECM land that you know of?
We're probably running through a lot of potential ones, yes. None that are currently recognized, but I think there would be quite a few that could well be in the mix. Certainly, if not on the route, very close to it. I won't mention particular names now of areas. I could, but I won't. But yeah, certainly. I think this is the start of something that in the next 10 to 15, 20 years could get quite sizable. Yeah.
Oh, that's very
So
exciting. Very exciting. Um, so to follow that up with a question from Rob Simmons, who I think is familiar to a lot of us. He's, I
mhm.
think, been on two conservation conversations this year. While you said that formally protected areas cannot be OECMs,
Mm.
would you encourage an OECM to become a formally protected area because the latter have more
Absolutely.
political clout?
I
Um,
think the first an OECM is a less onerous, much less of a commitment to conservation than a formal declaration. And in fact, just recently we've dealt with quite a few areas that, in my mind, are what I would call no-brainers for a formal declaration that we're looking at as for an OECM, reporting as an OECM as a first step. And again, I must something I forgot to say during my talk. Very importantly, people talk about declaring OECMs. That is incorrect. Nobody declares an OECM. We assess and report on them, and we recognize them. They are not declared in terms of any formal legislation at the moment. But certainly, if an area is hugely valuable for biodiversity conservation, and whoever manages or owns that area, be it a seascape or a landscape, is a willing to secure it for conservation, I would advocate that they go for a formal declaration. And there are incentives in place for that. And I think that is another subject for a webinar, or again, all on its own, and the whole stewardship mechanism and what it entails and what we're doing.
Okay, so that sort of answers a question from Wesley Evans, who asks that assuming an area meets the criteria for both, are there benefits to going an OECM route compared to biodiversity? You mentioned it's a lot easier to do an OECM type of
Yeah,
protection?
an OECM needs to be less onerous because you can't make it as onerous as say a nature reserve declaration. That's not to say that getting a declaration done is a huge mission. There is due diligence and a lot of work that needs to be done for it, but that's generally handled by the provincial authority or the NGO or a combination, depending on where we are. But yeah, it depends entirely on what the landowner or the community or whoever is on that land wants for their area. It's a completely voluntary thing, this as well. Nobody's forcing anything onto anybody. I know that answers that question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, if a given landowner or steward were to have the capacity and the time and the ability to declare something more formally, you would encourage that over an
And
OECM.
yeah, as long as it qualifies for a protected area category in either nature reserve or a protected environment, certainly we would encourage that because it gives a lot more long-term security, and it's recognized in terms of legislation. In the case of terrestrial areas, it gives the landowner a lot more security in terms of protection from inappropriate land use change, and that sort of thing as well. And as I say, it's completely voluntary, and it's done with the landowner, not it's not imposed on him or her or them. So yeah.
Okay, that kind of leads into a question that I've got from Alistair Stalker, who mentions that there are hundreds of game farms slash hunting farms. Would something like that be a good candidate for an OECM?
Good question, and yes, we are starting to engage with the wildlife ranching industry on exactly that. I think they range in their applicability and their conservation value. A game farm in the way that maybe it's a game breeding operation where animals are kept in pens and bred, that probably would not, well, not probably, that wouldn't be appropriate for an OECM, but an open area where the landowner runs a hunting operation, but the wildlife runs free and it's pretty much managed as to maintain a natural ecological habitat for those animals. That could possibly, that more than likely could certainly be recognized as an OECM. And that's also where I was talking about possible benefits to landowners like that. There could definitely be a marketing benefit in terms of marketing overseas. They saying, they're recognized as another effective area-based mechanism, and that could add some value to the way they market their property and their product that they're trying to sell. So yeah, certainly we are looking at that, and we're starting to work with them now.
Okay, so Steve, there is capacity and scope to engage with landowners of this type and encourage them and facilitate them putting their land in an OECM. That is that something that's going on, sort of actively recruiting in a way?
So we, if I'm understanding you correctly, our project is not actively working with landowners. We're trying to work with sectors of that could contribute to this project, and then build a process and facilitate a process whereby this then gets some momentum, and then we take it forward from there. So we're not actually engaging actively with landowners as a project at the moment, as our project at the moment, although it might lead to that in times to come. I think it's going to be essential because we do have a capacity issue in this country, and I think the NGOs are going to have to play quite a major role in helping to establish these areas and support to them after that as well. And it's a joint effort with our provincial and national colleagues to make this work as far as well as we possibly can.
So Steve, kind of a related question, I guess. In terms of, this is from Becca Mamela. He says great presentation, or they say great presentation, and ask, in terms of formalizing norms and standards, how far are we?
Thanks, Beggar, and good to know that. Good to, you know, I know Beggar well. We've known each other for a long time. So the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment are busy developing those norms and standards as we speak. They're busy going through all their various governments, MinTech and MinMech and those of committees for approval and feedback. And then those norms and standards will be put out for public comment. The actual timeframes for that, I wouldn't want to say anything now. I'm not entirely sure because we are not involved with the process at the moment. But there will be a public participation process whereby everybody can comment on those norms and standards. And I think it's important that we get them because they will determine the process to be followed to report an OECM. So we can get a lot of OECMs ready to go, but the process that they need to follow to get to the department to report it to the World Database in particular isn't really in place yet. And then they need those OECM, the norms and standards also need to assist with how we interpret the 8 criteria that is appropriate to our country's circumstances, which are pretty unique in the world. I mean, in all the various types of ownership structures and governance authorities and everything from communities to an individual owning land. So yeah, those norms and standards are essential to be able to guide this process and get norms and standards to get OECMs entrenched.
All right. Interesting, Steve. It's an ongoing thing, work in progress.
It's ongoing, and I know the department has said that they're aiming to have these ready for public comment in a couple of months' time. So we're hoping that it'll be out there, that we will be able to see them before the end of this year. That's the hope, and I know a lot of my colleagues are working very hard to make that happen.
All right, well, good to know. I mean, I think everyone knows that big wheels like this turn very slowly, but it's good to know that there's things underway. There's a follow-up question from Bego who asks about opportunities for training birders in traditional communities. I assume that's to do with the community bird guides, which you mentioned in your talk, Steve. So the person to talk to about that will be my colleague and a co-host, John Kinghorn. And Jess/tech support will put his contact details in the chat. And that's definitely someone to reach out to if you're interested either in becoming or facilitating community bird guides, which is a really, really wonderful initiative. Steve, Rachel Cooper Bohannon asks,
if I can just add to that.
Yes,
Steve, if I can just add to that, Beggar knows our colleague Nandi Tobela very well because I think he worked with her for a while. So Nandi is another person to approach on that too. So yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, either Nandi or John. All right, thanks, Steve. So Rachel Cooper Bohannon asks, well, firstly says great talk and thank you very much. And asks, was wondering if you had any advice on how to take a multi-taxa approach like KBAs to strengthen OECMs.
Yeah, so key biodiversity areas or KBAs, there's so many acronyms in this conservation game and sometimes you lose track of them. They are one of the key aspects that we look at when we screen an area for a potential OECM. Just last week, I was down in the Gouritz area in the Western Cape, and we looked at 4 pilot sites there. And one of the first things I did when doing the due diligence and screening beforehand is I do have the KBA layer on GIS, and you overlay the property boundaries on those, and if they fall within that KBA layer, that automatically tells us that there is potential that area is conserving important biodiversity. Then the next thing would be to go and ground truth that and make sure that is in fact the case, because often what happens is the map will tell you that there's an important whatever on that property, and you go and you have a look and it's either under concrete or it's plowed up or something. So you can't just go off a desktop. You actually have to go out there and look. But yes, key biodiversity areas are a very important thing that we consider, source of information that we consider when we looking at these assessments. So it's not just one. We don't want to look at just one species. It needs to be a systems approach if we can help it. Yeah.
It reminds me of something that popped into my head while you were speaking, Steve. I was wondering about the scale. How small can something be? How small can a piece of land be that's worth it? Does it depend on the species that inhabit it, or are there other things that are
Yeah,
considered?
I think it's entirely dependent on the circumstances around that particular area. We do like to say that the area needs to be big enough to be viable as a conservation entity, but what is that? I mean, we've declared nature reserves that are 100 hectares or less in size, because they have an important species like blue swallow on them. So if this, for instance, there's a critically endangered and endemic plant species on a 10 or 20 hectare piece of ground, and those areas are managed for the system that species occurs in, and it's one of the only places that we can conserve that species in, then then that 10 hectares is something that we need to look at. So it depends entirely on the circumstances of the area and what it's there to, what we're looking to conserve in it.
So if one of us were fortunate enough to have 10 or 20 hectares of land, not that I do by any means, but if we were to, how would one even go about knowing if they have an endangered plant or caterpillar or butterfly, that lives on that land?
By inviting somebody who's an expert in that sort of field to come and do a survey and have a look.
So you'd encourage anyone, no
I
matter
can
what
name
kind of
names, but I
size of
won't.
land they have, they should invite some local conservationist, ecologist around and have a little
Well,
walk around the property.
I think if you're in a position where you suspect that you have something really special on your property and it is only 10 or 20 hectares, it is definitely worth getting somebody who is knowledgeable on that particular component of our natural heritage to come and have a look and advise. I would suggest that they do that before pursuing anything further than that. A good example, and I see my colleague Jabulani is on tonight. SAPI has an area in KZN that is, sure, Jab, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it has the Karkloof blue butterfly on it. It's no more than 10 or 20 hectares big, and that is being in the process of being declared a nature reserve for that reason, because it is one or two or three sites in the world where that particular butterfly occurs. So it's very important that it gets conserved. So although it's not very big, it is possible to get these things done.
Yeah. So depending on the circumstances surrounding that piece of land,
Yeah.
suppose that sort of answers a question from Alison Lee Cox, who asks if botanical gardens would also be considered.
Yes, but not the areas that they've planted gardens in. It would need to be the natural areas that are in those botanical gardens. So, like I'm just thinking, most of these botanical gardens have large natural areas that they manage as natural areas. So those could definitely be recognized as OECMs.
Okay, good to know. Let's hope someone from Sambi's online. So you mentioned Jabulani Hlophe, your friend earlier, or colleague rather, says, thanks, Steve, for a great talk. This is a key example of all the acronyms that you deal with in this field. The N and S by DFFE, would they be under NEMPA? So the norms and standards by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries
Yeah.
and Environment, would they be under? And that's where I lose it. I don't know what NEMPA is.
I stand under correction, but I think those norms and standards are being developed under the Biodiversity Act and not the Protected Areas Act. I think there are, and if I'm correct on that, there are reasons for it, which I'm not fully familiar with, but they are being developed under the Biodiversity Act, and as I say, I stand under correction, but I'm pretty confident that I'm not wrong on that one.
Peter Fencer asks if that the Freda Fort Dome might not have an OECM status. So is there any guidance that you'd be able to provide or unpack for landowners within this community? And I suppose that extends to other people that suspect they're, maybe land of value that isn't protected currently. How can they go about
Yeah, so we actually we've had a meeting with the Freda Fort Dome guys a couple of weeks back to discuss this, and I'm trying to I wouldn't be able to go into detail now, but we can certainly engage further with Vredefort Dome to look at this. But Vredefort Dome is a World Heritage Site, so it probably needs a higher level of conservation protection than an OECM. But I'm sure it's something that we can and happily to engage further on that with you. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, just a reminder that, Steve will be available to answer further questions. I'm sure he'll avail himself to replying to some emails over the following week if there are any burning questions that we don't get to tonight, or any ideas that have been sparked. Steve, sorry for committing you to
Yeah,
that, but I'm
that's what
sure
we're here
that you'll be
for.
more than happy to. So you mentioned World Heritage Sites with regards to Vredefort Dome. Andrew Hall asks, there's a 65-hectare natural heritage site proclaimed in January 1993 next to Nelspruit. What protection would this legally enjoy in today's era?
The natural heritage site at the moment is there by name only. I think it doesn't enjoy any formal protection at the moment, but it is certainly an area that could be looked at. Again, without knowing any of the background to the area and what it's important for, it could certainly be looked at for recognition as an OECM and reporting if the landowner is willing and gives their consent for that. So, but the natural heritage program pretty much is non-existent anymore, and it was very good in its day, but I think it's been mostly replaced by biodiversity stewardship in its various categories. So, yeah, yeah,
There's no way of
I don't know what
knowing
else to say on
offhand.
that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Similar question from an Annalie Bakema, who I take it as a member of the MCSA, the Mountain Club of South Africa. Mountain Club owns pretty incredible tracts of land throughout the country, and they also engage in a lot of conservation work, especially helihacks and similar things like that to remove invasive species. She asks if this includes this MCSA, if OECMs include land belonging to the Mountain Club of South Africa.
Absolutely. We'd be very happy to include the Mountain Club of South Africa, and I'm very glad you brought that up because one of the things we need to be doing in the next year is running OECM training workshops and things in the various provinces with the key stakeholder groups, and the Mountain Club of South Africa would be a key stakeholder group, which I'm embarrassed to say on my database at the moment, I haven't got anybody from there on there yet, but that is a prompt to chase that up because it's something that and the Mountain Club is active all through the country, wherever there are mountains. So as long as there is a governance entity in place and they're willing to consent to being assessed and reported on, yeah, absolutely. And as long as those areas as well are not already recognized in terms of the Protected Areas Act, then we can look at OECMs. Yeah.
Great.
And I
That's
mean,
good to know.
and I think my WWF colleagues would be very happy to hear that as well, because strategic water source areas are crucially important, and that is a key focus of WWF South Africa at the moment as well, and they are mainly in the mountains as strategic water source areas.
Steve, would it be appropriate for you to give us an idea of some of the organizations? Maybe you can anonymize it, but some of the types of organizations that you're working with?
Yeah, so we're working at the moment. We're working quite closely with some of the biosphere reserves in the country. We only have the capacity and the time to work with 3 of them, but that will serve as templates and ways forward to replicate in others. There are quite a few biosphere reserves, and mainly to look at OECMs within those biosphere reserves, because as you'll know, they are huge areas. And one of the key things for an OECM is that you have to have a governance authority. And when you have several hundred landowners of different types, it's very unlikely you're going to get one governance authority for a biosphere. So biospheres are areas that we look to, particularly in the buffer areas of those biospheres, to pinpoint key areas that we can look at recognizing and reporting OECMs on. And then the biosphere management teams themselves in future years can look at adding to that as well. So we're trying to work with the biospheres at the moment to look at pilot starts and get the management teams trained, in inverted commas, on how to assess and report on OECMs so that they can take it forward in years to come, in times to come. And yeah, as I said, the wildlife ranching industry, we're going to be starting to work with them and to look at hopefully getting some things going there. And then, yeah, the various provincial authorities going forward, looking at pilot sites within the provinces that are not necessarily in biospheres or other. And then importantly, we need some pilot marine OECMs, which are quite tricky because, well, there are a whole bunch of reasons for it, and it's probably a good topic for a webinar on its own, the whole marine space and how but we are collaborating with colleague NGOs to look at the marine side of things. So yeah.
All right, Steve, with all the
I hope that answers you.
Yeah, I hope so. With all the breakout webinars that you've kind of suggested, I think you should start your own series at this point. Maybe just do a dedicated series at the start of next year where it's just you for 5 episodes with all these ideas you've had.
Oh,
Are you up to that?
I don't know. I'll have to not run comrades instead or something.
All right. You mentioned marine
Yeah.
OECMs, and there's a question from Elisa Nupin who asks, because you mentioned the African penguin, the critically endangered African penguin earlier, and the island closures that were recently delivered earlier this year. Could you elaborate on where and how an OECM approach could be applied in this context?
Okay, so WWF South Africa have recently published, in fact, in June, so 2 months ago, what they call a roadmap for assessing and reporting on marine OECMs for South Africa. And in that report, which you be able to find on WWF's website, I'm pretty sure, they lay out what their recommendations for how this needs to be approached. And I think that they give 12 different categories of marine OECMs that have potential for OECMs. And they did pilot assessments on all of those 12, and there were a handful of those 12 that came out to be of particular potential, one of which were the Penguin Island closures. None of them have been actually assessed properly and reported on, and there are issues with who the governance authority would be for some of them. So those are some of the things that need to be clarified and sorted out before we can report on them as OECMs. But the big thing with Penguin Island closures is that they do have a boundary. They have a designated boundary as to where they end and where they start. And they do have they have obvious biodiversity conservation benefits and value. So, but I think, without rambling on too much, I think the short answer would be to get hold of that WWF report and have a look at it. It gives a very nice summary of the way forward that we should be taking in this country as well for marine side of things, which is more difficult than the land side because of, I mean, who owns the sea? It's like, yeah, and who manages it. So yeah,
Yeah, you'll be pleased to know that our colleagues Jess Wilmot, aka Tech Support, and Charlotte Boyd have both shared that report, a link to that report in the chat. So let's hope that some people who are interested can read those and find out some more about this tricky topic. One follow-up question from Lisa, who asked about the penguins. Is monitoring and evaluation part of OECM protocols?
Well, I think for it to have value in the long term, it has to be. And how we deal with that, sure, I don't know at the moment, because it's all I can say is it's going to be needing a big effort and a collaborative effort on behalf of government entities and the NGO sector. Because I think there does need to be an element of not just monitoring, because you don't want to be out there just looking over somebody's shoulder and wielding a big stick, but there needs to be quite an element of support as well. And that is a huge undertaking, particularly if we're looking at several thousands and in fact, sometimes millions of hectares quoted as being reported on as OECMs. So that is a key issue, and I mean it's an issue right now in conservation in this country is the management support to protected areas. So it's something that there are resources available to possibly extend work going into the future, and it's something we're going to have to look at quite carefully. But yeah, it has to be part of what we do, because what we don't want is what we call paper parks, where it's there in theory, but it's really not effective on the ground. So we have to do whatever we can to try and support and monitor the effectiveness of these areas in the years to come.
And I suppose these are all part of the discussions around
Yeah.
finalizing the NNS, the norms and standards, right?
Absolutely. That aspect has to be come into that, as to what, how do we deal with this? And yeah.
So Steve, I think we all out of questions, but I've just got one of my own. With regards to the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity agreement of protecting 30% of our land. Where are we on that? Is there a number that's been floating around? Is it being updated
No,
regularly?
I know that those targets in terms of numbers of hectares and so on are busy being finalized as we speak, through the development of, and I should have mentioned it in my talk. I did have a note to do that, and I obviously overlooked it. To a thing called the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And there were some targets set, which the NGO sector didn't agree with, and we believe they're not ambitious enough. So there are a number of meetings that have been going on lately to look at that and to revise that National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And at the end of that, there should be some figures on targets for actual number of hectares and numbers of kilometers of coastline and so on and so forth. But at the moment, those figures are not available. I don't know if they are available. I don't think they are.
So it hasn't been robustly established at this point where we are so far with that target.
So given that there have been over 20 million hectares of protected areas declared in the last 10 years, 20 years, I stand under correction now, mainly through biodiversity stewardship, we have gone some way to contribute to the targets, but 30% is huge, and it's very ambitious, and obviously there's going to be every effort made to get there. And we have made progress towards getting there, but in terms of percentage and how far we are towards that, I would have to go and check that up. I wouldn't want to suck my thumb now and guess and give an incorrect answer. We'd have to go and check that.
Sure. I was doing some back of the notebook maths while you were talking, and I worked out it's around 366,000 square kilometers, which is larger than the area of Germany or Italy or Ecuador.
It's huge.
Yeah,
it's
huge, really
immense. And given the other pressures that this country has, and it is very challenging. So, yeah.
All right. Well, we'll await eagerly for these reports to start trickling out and norms and standards to be finalized and things like that. We'll have to have you on again when that is the case. But yeah, on behalf of BirdLife South Africa and everyone else that's been in this webinar, thanks very, very much, Steve, for joining us and sharing your expertise. And we look forward to having you back.
Anytime.
Thanks. Are there any final points you want to share?
No, just again, thank you to everybody for joining us tonight and giving up your time. It's been a pleasure to do this, and I'm happy to do more. And if there are any other questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. I don't profess to be an expert in any of this, but we give our best. So yeah, we'll carry on doing that. But thank you all for your time tonight, and thank you, Kurt, for hosting and doing such a fantastic job of that. Yeah, much appreciated.
Thanks very much, Jan. Apologies on small foot. What's that, Steve?
No, I said thanking to Jess for her support and making sure things run smoothly.
Yeah, we won't ask Jess to turn on her camera in the tech support role. I think she's not prepared for that. But thanks very much, Jess, as well for joining. And yeah, if you have any further questions for Steve, you can email info@birdlife.org.za or conversations@birdlife.org.za, and you can get in touch with him that way, and we'll be sure to get those questions to him. And as always, this webinar will be on YouTube in a few days, and you'll be able to review and familiarize yourself with anything and go through it again. Lots of intense stuff being spoken about today. So I'm sure there'll be people checking in again and watching it again, Steve, just to get a bit more of your knowledge. So thanks so much for being online and for sharing. Anyway, good luck with the
No,
training,
it's
and I
been a
hope
pleasure.
your
Thank you.
tweaked hamstring isn't giving you too much grief going forward.
It's more my age that's giving me grief, but anyway.
There's no excuses, Steve. No excuses. Comrades is calling.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
I'm under pressure.
All right. Good
Thanks,
night,
everybody.
everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.